Hello, and welcome to the Language Justice During COVID-19 webinar. My name is Payton, and I'll be your moderator today. I run the Disaster Advocacy Program at Legal Services of the Virgin Islands. I became closely involved with ABA Disaster Legal Services when the U.S. Virgin Islands was hit with 2 Category 5 hurricanes in September 2017. In the aftermath of the hurricanes, I was a central point of contact between FEMA, the ABA, and volunteer attorneys to provide pro bono legal services to disaster survivors. Through my experience, I've learned how hard it is to obtain FEMA and other emergency documents in the languages that are spoken in my community. You'll learn today that providing information in different languages is just the tip of the iceberg in the movement towards language justice. There is so much more that we can do. I'll be honest and say that even with today's webinar, there's more that we should do to implement language justice principles into this presentation. For example, this webinar is only available in English, the dominant language in the US, and that limits who can fully participate with us today. We are exploring how we might use tools for inclusion like interpreting, translated materials, and captioning in the future. As a young lawyer, I hope that all of my colleagues watching this presentation today can take away several tools and examples of language justice principles and implement them into your practice. We have a lineup of fantastic speakers. Jeannie Ortiz will give a background on what we've learned about language access from past emergencies and discuss technology-based advocacy strategies to increase language access. Elena Ulias will teach us language justice key terms and how they apply to COVID-19. Joann Lee will discuss language justice barriers, services, and advocacy during COVID-19. We should have time at the end of the program for Q&A. We received lots of questions during registration that we will pull from. You can also submit questions during this program by typing your question into the Q&A box on your screen. All right, let's get started with Jeannie Ortiz.
Thank you, Casey, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm with Pro Bono Net and the Disaster Legal Services Program from the American Bar Association, and I'll give more information about what we do in a few minutes. But if you advance to the next slide, we wanted to first start with just the basis for language access, right? And start with the federal authority and examples of state laws and guidance that ensure language access. And this is a section of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which I think is that all-encompassing authority, right? Which forbids discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in federal programs and activities receiving financial assistance. And national origin is that protected category used when we talk about language access. So when we refer to language access, and that discrimination may be both intentional discrimination and also practices that have a discriminatory impact on applicants or beneficiaries in these programs because of their race, color, or national origin. And like I said, this means that all federal agencies that provide grants of assistance are required to enforce this. And then there is further guidance on enforcement of this section through an executive order that was signed in 2000 that Joann will talk about. But you will see that although this is the guiding authority, state laws and language access policies from across agencies will vary and even guarantee certain rights to ensure language access through their own guidance and procedures. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. So this is Joann Lee. I'm just going to jump into Jeannie's presentation for a couple slides to talk a little bit about other federal mandates. Jeannie already talked about Title VI. But we also have other federal statutes that talk about language access. Some of them are listed here, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, which covers individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing, which is also very important that we include in this discussion. Other federal statutes, such as the Affordable Care Act and the Fair Housing Act, also have anti-discrimination clauses included. So those are also things that can be enforced. And as was mentioned, there's Executive Order 13166, which was signed by President Clinton in 2000. And this further discusses the obligations under Title VI, but also did something very interesting, which is it also made federal agencies themselves also have to follow the spirit of Title VI. So they don't fall under the Title VI mandates because they are a federal agency themselves, like the Social Security Administration. They are not part of Title VI, but under this executive order, they also have to provide meaningful language access at the Social Security offices. This also covers the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, other agencies that conduct the activities themselves rather than give out funding. So that was a very important executive order, although obviously it's not as easy to enforce as a federal statute. So we can move on to the next slide. Just an example, in California, we have our own version of Title VI, which is at Government Code 11135. We also have other statutes that cover language access provisions in the courts and in other contexts. If you have a certain percentage of people that you serve that speak a certain language, you have to have bilingual staffing, so things like that. There's also very local ordinances. So you'll see like certain cities like San Francisco or Oakland or Long Beach, New York City, they have their own mandates for city agencies and city funding as well. And then you have entities like the ABA that provides more model rules and guidance and standards. And then, for example, some of you may be funded by Legal Services Corporation, which is the largest funder of legal aid. That's federal funding. We're also have to follow the mandates of Title VI as federal fund recipients, and LSC put out their own guidance on this topic. So the next slide, finally, this is just a quick example in the administrative hearing context. I think I saw a question about that submitted. So I just wanted to give some examples that not in the courts, but in the administrative hearings, there's some agencies that also require that interpreters be provided. So I just wanted to offer that as an example. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joann. So just for a little bit of context, I work, this is Jeannie Ortiz, I work for Pro Bono Net, a nonprofit based out of New York, and we partner with civil legal organizations across the country to support their impact in addressing the legal needs of low-income individuals and communities. And we also support a range of access to justice initiatives using technology-driven strategies such as self-help websites, self-help legal forums, and tools. And I'm also a member of the American Bar Association's Disaster Legal Services program, where we partner with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, commonly referred to as FEMA, and legal services organizations to provide legal help to disaster impacted communities. So with that in mind, I'll mostly be speaking to my experience in disaster relief and recovery based on the work that we've done and the impact of language access in that context. And we'll be referring to some examples from my experience in the immediate aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And in sharing that information, I hope that some of the strategies and lessons learned will overlap with what we're seeing right now in the midst of the public health crisis. So to conceptualize language access a little bit more in times of crisis, I think there's a lot that we can learn from other times of emergencies, such as natural disasters. And actually, this is actually timely in a way since hurricane season just started this week. But in those times of emergencies, we've learned and consistently heard that language barriers, such as not providing timely and accurate information to people, makes recovery a way more difficult path to navigate. And response and recovery in times of natural disasters or public health emergencies already present a variety of challenges that I think legal aid and pro bono attorneys know too well, such as issues related to housing, employment, or family law. I mean, it's a long list. But when you add language obstacles to that recovery process, whether it's through administrative agencies or courts or through the provision of legal services, I think way too often and way too many people, we see that way too often families and individuals are left behind without clear, accessible, and workable options to recover. And the work of our partners and other advocacy organizations have confirmed time and time again that language access needs are critical to address in any preparedness plans, and also documenting those challenges that we see, things that worked and didn't work in past emergencies is as important. And when it comes to the challenges and the list that you see on your screen, it's not meant to be a comprehensive list, but we've seen that the barriers in emergencies are often related to interpretation, translation, plain language materials, and timely and proper notification in accessible ways to people impacted by an emergency. And one note on that last bullet point, inaccurate legal translations, and I'll provide an example in a few seconds, is that I think they're often common, I would say, in emergencies because we want to push out information as quickly as possible, right? And when using machine translation services like Google Translate or perhaps someone who knows the language and can quickly translate it from one day to the other, I think a lot can be lost and can lead to incorrect and unreliable information. And to provide two examples of this, if you can go to the, next slide. So this is one example of how one word, I think, can change the meaning of the message that we want to communicate. The words in past emergencies, the words applications and appeals in Spanish were often used interchangeably. And that was important because one was a general federal disaster assistance application with the agency, and the other one was an appeal letter if the person who applied for assistance was denied that assistance. And the appeals process was sometimes considered, rightfully so, as part of the overall application process. But the tricky part was that deadlines to apply for help were extended several times, and there was a lot of legal rights information being disseminated about the appeals process. So at one point, it became useful and helpful to make that distinction. Next slide, please. And so, like I said, when we use machine translation services like Google Translate, words can become an entirely different thing from the intended word or sentence. And just for purposes of this example, I'll use New Jersey only because that's where I'm joining from. But the one you see on your left, let's say it's part of an organization name, but when you have the translation that people read, it's hard to understand what the phrase is within the context of the message, and may cause, like we've seen, unnecessary confusion about eligibility for a program. And then let's say the word on the right was meant to be background information, so at the top, antecedentes. So it was meant to be background information on a particular service, but when translated, it may mean something related to criminal records or history, because in some Spanish dialects, the word antecedentes is often used when referring to criminal records or history. So I think this is really to highlight the importance and just give practical examples of why having qualified translators and interpreters in reviewing documentation or providing services is important, because that context and culture and legal terminology will matter. Great. So what does that just recovery look like? And what have we learned from other emergencies? It looks like providing emergency-related warning and notifications in multiple languages and updated information in the same languages as well. Emergency-related information reaching people in a way that they can understand it, absorb it quickly, and have clear pathways to act upon that information. And that includes accessible information for people with low literacy and people whose first language is not English. And I would say not even to the public, provide that information, not only to the public, but also to service providers and government working on the field. It also looks like working with qualified interpreters when and as needed, ensuring that documents and information are accurately translated, like I said, bearing in mind legal terminology, ensuring that people who are deaf or hard of hearing are also properly informed through qualified sign language interpreters, providing information through multiple outlets and communication channels, and also working with language justice networks and groups to identify the needs and strategies to respond, and also working with trusted organizations who already have relationships in their communities to disseminate the information. Next slide, please. And so I'll just share two examples of advocacy and recovery strategies that we've seen in past emergencies. And one interesting strategy used in the wake of Hurricane Florence in the Carolinas was a story map project by several local organizations and the Self-Represented Litigation Network to capture and identify the communities most vulnerable to the effects and impacts of the disaster. And one of the sections identified information on the amount of people in the Carolinas who have limited English proficiency. And out of that amount, the number of people who lived in the area impacted by the disaster. And this was also used in Florida after Hurricane Irma to really help and use this data to help inform the decisions around recovery and the needs of communities in that recovery phase. Next slide, please. And one other strategy used in the wake of emergencies, and I think also in general, has been storytelling and voices for civil justice. I feel like they deserve a shout out, a big shout out on this. Has great resources for advocacy, for templates, social media strategies, and writing and developing op-eds to shine a light on the issues affecting communities, which often include language access needs. Next slide, please. Okay, so just switching gears a little bit and towards other strategies that could apply to a broader set of activities in the wake of COVID-19 and other access to justice efforts in general, I'll share some technology-based strategies that we've used, our partners have used, and others that we have seen since COVID-19 became a national emergency. Next slide. So online interactive self-help forums have been a strategy used by courts and legal services providers to help people complete legal forms in an interactive way, where they can enter the information based on the question on the form, and the answers are then input into a document a person can download or print to file with the court or with an administrative agency. And these forms are powered by Law Help Interactive, which is a program of Pro Bono Net. And then the two examples that you see on your screen are forms that were built or translated to Spanish for people to complete petitions for orders of protection in cases of domestic violence. And when we talk about COVID-19, I think it's important to say that since the stay-at-home orders were implemented, there has been a spike in domestic violence incidents. So the use of these forms have been particularly timely. On the DC courts interviews, our Law Help Interactive team engaged professional plain language specialists and translators to translate the interviews and forms. And our team also worked to validate the translation by the court's Office of Interpreters to make sure that they were in agreement with the commonly used terms by litigants, and also in agreement with the Spanish used on the court's website page. And in Puerto Rico, which also has a stay-at-home order, the court system established a procedure. I think if you can go to the, which also has established a procedure so that domestic violence victims can file petitions for protection orders remotely and without having to go to the court or a police station. They've also been using this during COVID-19. So once someone completes the form, they can send an email to the court to file the petition they created through the system. And this is just to say that, you know, these forms are flexible for use in multiple languages, and are also ways that programs have looked for other ways to implement these strategies to increase language access. Next slide. And then legal aid programs that manage statewide self-help websites and dedicated COVID-19 web pages have also included information in multiple languages and information about legal rights related to language access. I'll say also that live chat and chatbot technology has also been another strategy in reaching people in languages other than English to answer questions people may have about their legal rights and COVID-19. Great, next slide. And here's another example of how video formats are used to disseminate information related to COVID-19. And I found this interesting because these videos were part of, and they continue to be updated, part of a series of videos in American Sign Language and with captions posted on the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services and their Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Next slide, please. And we outline here some practical tips on some of the strategies in using technology, such as plain language tools like Write Clearly, which is a bookmark that you can add to your browser, and it will scan your page to spot text that can be changed to a 6th grade reading level. It's also available as an add-on feature to Google Docs. Also, programs with in-person clinics have shifted to remote clinics and are using publicly available video conferencing tools to facilitate consultations between attorneys and clients. And we know that Zoom has come with its challenges around security, but the breakout room feature has been helpful for large clinics or groups where volunteers and attorneys are split into smaller groups for a more focused discussion. And I'm aware that, yeah, we know that the Zoom has a simultaneous interpretation feature, which we can't use in breakout rooms, but the smaller rooms feature allows for live captions to be activated, and then just in general for people who can join those smaller groups, if they're another participant, to provide interpretation. And then the screenshot that you see on your right is another example of how we've used the creation of resources in plain language with an organization that is based in New York, which really has, I would encourage everyone to visit their website, the Center for Urban Pedagogy, a nonprofit design agency. Really focuses on creating materials that are in plain language, and they partner with organizations not only in New York, but they can also partner with organizations across the country if that's something that your programs would want to do. Next slide. Great, and then here are other tips and resources that we recommend, just perusing for virtual facilitation with language access in mind. The National Network to End Domestic Violence through their website, textsafety.org, has a guide and best practices on accessibility for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and also tools and tips on communicating with clients. And these tips were published with domestic violence in mind, victims in mind, but I think could be used and applied as well in other settings. And I would be remiss to exclude the use of social media and providing information through the lens of language access. So, I mean, I've seen virtual town halls and Know Your Rights events organized in a variety of languages. And also the Poor People's Campaign has also been using Facebook, Instagram, and other tools for communication in American Sign Language to communicate information and organize within the deaf community. And we'll be sharing other resources as well that touch on some of these. Next slide, please. And I'll finish with some best practices on language access, just based on my experience, which I've covered, I think, most of it already. But if you go to the next slide, here are some of the qualities to consider when seeking and working with interpreters, which is a short list from a longer list in the Language Justice Toolkit I linked at the bottom. But I'll certainly point out that when working with interpreters, I think that looking for that patience is certainly key, and just working with someone who is respectful of the process and the person. And so really an emphasis on not rushing through the process and trying to accurately communicate what the person is saying. And I'm sure my co-panelists will have more to share on this as well. Next slide, please. And then finally, some things to consider when advocating and thinking about language access strategies. And feel free to enter your own best practices in the chat box. We'd love to see what other practices you all recommend. But one thing we've learned in times of emergencies is that it takes time and capacity to update translated information. And that's especially true when the information is constantly changing. So it's definitely not a one-time thing. And as attorneys, I think there's an opportunity for us to be mindful about how language, culture, and history can come into play when we're communicating. So I think a good practice is to rely on trusted community-based organizations who can speak to these, and also as attorneys, think about the assumptions we may have about our clients and challenge those assumptions accordingly. One tip from my colleague as well is that when working with interpreters and translators, it's good to create a style guide for your interpreters or translators so that everyone uses the same word and for the same concept. So for example, agreeing on one word to use for court or for lawyer if there are variations of that word. And I'll just drop a link with an example of this guide from Maryland, created by the Maryland Access to Justice Commission. And I'll just add that to the chat box. And otherwise, I can turn it over to Alina right now. Thank you. I think you're muted.
Hi, everyone. While I'm bringing up my slides, I want to invite you, if you would, to drop in the chat box one word that reflects what the language is that you use yourself or in your family, what they mean to you. And I'm going to bring this up and make sure that I can see the slides correctly, and we'll go from there. Okay. So thank you so much, Jeannie, for your great presentation. And thank you, Casey and the ABA Young Lawyers Division for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's an honor to be here. And I really want to thank everyone who joined us for your time and your energy. It's an extremely difficult time in the US and the world right now. And I hope that all of you and your loved ones are safe and as well as possible. My presentation will be focusing on language justice principles and how they apply to started on the right foot. One question that came in beforehand that I wanted to address very briefly. Many of you asked, why isn't there an interpreter on the panel? So I do want to let you know that I am formally trained as a court as well as a community interpreter, though most of my time these days is in my role as a language justice advocate and educator working with California Rural Legal Assistance. I think it's wonderful that we have so many interpreters as well as attorneys and others with us today. One thing I believe is that more dialogue and collaboration between attorneys and interpreters is one part of advancing language justice. So let's dive right into court concepts. When I ask people what their languages mean to them, many people immediately use positive words like family, culture, and connection. So a language justice approach recognizes that language can be used both as a tool of connection and empowerment, as well as a tool of oppression and violence. For example, we can look back to our country's early history and the way that language was used as a weapon of racism and colonialism by forcibly suppressing the languages of enslaved people and indigenous people. And then we can look to the not so distant history when students in US schools were punished, faced with physical punishment for using non-English language in classrooms. And many people with us today may remember that themselves or have parents who do. So that's the context for what we're talking about when we talk about a language justice framework and how it's different than a language access approach. Many of us are used to discussing forms of structural inequality like racism and sexism. So I want to introduce a term that may be new for many of us, which is linguicism. Linguicism refers to a pattern in our society that results in advantages and benefits for people who speak the dominant language, which in the United States is English, and a pattern of disadvantages and barriers for people who use non-dominant spoken and sign languages and are not fully proficient in spoken English. And so that's a group that includes many people who are immigrants, members of indigenous communities, and people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So how many people are we talking about when we talk about people who are targeted by linguicism? We see in some data here in the first 2 points that speaks to this. When we're talking about people who primarily use spoken languages and non-dominant spoken languages and are not fully proficient in English, we're talking about 8% of the US population, more than double that here in California. And there are 37 million adults in the US who are deaf and hard of hearing. What are some of the ways that people who are, yes?
I just wanted to let you know that your slides are not showing.
Oh no.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you so much for telling me.
Sorry.
No, I'm so glad you told me. We tested this, of course, and then of course it's being weird. So you all didn't get to see these cute kids. Here they are. And here's our definition of linguicism, and I'll catch you up. We're looking at the data slides, so I really apologize, everyone. In points 3 through 6, we see some examples of what structural inequality looks like for folks who primarily use non-dominant languages. And I want to invite you to put in the chat the data point that you would use if you had to speak to a colleague who's not here today and you wanted to give them a sense of what we're talking about. We have data here that shows that people who are not fully proficient in English experience poverty at twice the rate as proficient English speakers, that nearly half of adults who speak limited English don't have a high school diploma, and that immigrants who have limited English proficiency are more likely to report poor health than English-speaking immigrants. So keep it going in the chat. That's a way for you to engage with each other, although I won't be able to see and respond to everything you share right now. So if we're saying that linguicism is a form of oppression based on language, then language justice is the response to that inequity. Like other aspirational social justice goals, like racial justice or gender justice, language justice is an evolving concept that can be defined in many ways, and those of you joining us may have a different definition than I do, and that's great. One question that was sent in beforehand was, what are the principles that attorneys and interpreters should keep in mind to foster language justice? And I have 3 principles listed here that I'd like to highlight. The first one is respect for everyone's language rights, which includes the right everyone has to communicate, to understand, and to be understood in our languages. The second you see here is equitable communication. Equitable communication is an approach in which everyone impacted by an issue has the right to participate in addressing it. So it goes beyond the idea of access and says that, people who use non-dominant languages shouldn't be just passive recipients of services and information. Rather, they should have the opportunity to actively contribute and take up leadership in the solutions to problems that affect them most. And the third principle here is communicative autonomy, which is the right for people who use non-dominant languages to speak for themselves and make their own decisions about how they communicate. So here we have a slide that talks more broadly about language rights. In kind of more conventional language access conversations, we tend to focus a lot on the right to an interpreter and to translated documents, which is really important and something that I'm very passionate about. But language rights is actually much broader than that. We have other examples here, such as the right to be free from discrimination based on language, and the right to preserve our languages and pass them on to future generations, which may take place through things like multilingual language programs in public education. So when we think about language rights, we want to think broadly and not reduce language justice and language rights only to the right to the interpreter, as important as that is. So Another question we received was, how do you differentiate language access from language justice? They are not the same thing. And I agree with you. One way to conceptualize language justice is as a continuum. From language exclusion on one side, where people who use non-dominant languages cannot participate at all and face severe discrimination, to language tolerance, where language differences in language might be tolerated to some degree but aren't welcome, to language access, where people who use non-dominant languages have some degree of access to essential programs but still face barriers to full participation. And finally, language justice, which we can imagine as full participation, inclusion, and self-determination of all people, regardless of the languages they use. So we're going to do an activity for you to test out these concepts and see what you think. I'm going to share a poll in just a moment, and it's going to have 8 examples related to language inclusion during COVID-19 response. And I'm going to invite you to respond, and I'll invite you to respond only to 4 of the 8 questions to save some time. If your last name starts with A through M, please only answer questions 1 through 4 and click no response on 5 through 8. And if your last name starts with N through Z, please only answer questions 5 through 8 and click no response for questions 1 through 4. So you're just doing half and clicking no response on the others. There's also no right or wrong answers. I encourage you not to overthink it. We're asking for your opinion. And each question is going to ask you, when you look at this scenario, which are all real examples, they're a little California focused, so apologies about that. That's my context. When you look at this example, where would you place it on the continuum? Closer to language exclusion, language tolerance, language access, or language justice? And then we'll see what people think. If you have any questions about accessing the poll or the instructions, please drop them in the chat, and I'm going to launch the poll now, and we'll have a few minutes for everybody to respond, and then we'll look at the answers. I'm also going to bring up another slide that has all the examples up there in a random order, so you can kind of see them in relation to each other. Okay, do you all have the slides live?
We have the slides. You might want to go back one though, so people can read the instructions.
Sure. All right. Oh, now I see responses starting to come in. So I see a couple of questions. If you can't see all the questions, please scroll down. There should be, for me, it looks like a gray scrolling bar on the right-hand side of the poll to see the rest of the questions. And to submit, you have to answer all the questions. So if you answered on the other 4, please mark the no response option. Okay, I'm gonna give folks just a couple more, about another minute to wrap up. And while I do that, I'm actually gonna rearrange the slides to reflect, or rearrange the examples to reflect what I'm seeing in your responses. Okay. So here we go. I have the slide up that reflects what the majority of you said about each one of these examples. And we can see down here at language exclusion, we have the Punjabi speaking mother who was not given an interpreter and her whole family became infected with COVID-19. We have the comments from the New York City healthcare workers who said that patients with limited English proficiency are being left alone and without appropriate care. We have California unemployment claims, which are available only to people who use Spanish and English, not the rich diversity of our state. At Language Tolerance, we have Google Translate being promoted as a way for students or parents to help their kids with distance learning. And then we have a bunch at Language Access, Washington State Plan, the LA Tenants Unions working with interpreters on their mutual aid network, and Cielo's series of videos in Indigenous languages of Latin America. And we have CRLA online board meetings at the language justice stage, which is an example from my own organization, which I can tell you it's been very challenging, especially in terms of tech access for all of our board members. So this is really interesting. I really thank you all for participating. And I encourage you to think about your own organization, agency, or firm, and where you would put your practices on this continuum from language exclusion to language justice, and where those areas for growth are. And I want to leave you with a couple key points. Jeannie said something similar to this earlier, that in an emergency, in a crisis, we can't check our values at the door. Sometimes because there's so much going on, it's hectic, so much communication is suddenly going online that we used to do in person, it can be easy to leave language justice practices behind, or have language justice practices be thought of as kind of as an afterthought. But too much is at stake right now to use poor practices like relying on Google Translate, or ad hoc or untrained bilingual people instead of qualified interpreters, or providing information to people about their legal rights only in English during the pandemic. Instead, this is a critical time to be intentional and diligent in our efforts to reach people who use non-dominant languages. in all the diversity of those communities, not just Spanish and English speakers. That's another pitfall, right? Is saying, oh, if we have Spanish English interpreters or provide Spanish language materials, we can check off the box, when we have a country that's incredibly linguistically diverse, and leaving out all other languages leaves many linguistically marginalized communities without access to critical information and services during a very difficult time. So there's a lot you can do, whether you already have a robust language access plan in your agency or you're just getting started, to make sure that people who use non-dominant languages both have access to life-saving services, critical information, as well as making sure that all people can make their voices heard and actively be a part of a just recovery. So now we're going to transition to hearing from Joann Lee from the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, who will lead us through thinking about how we can move along the continuum in the legal services community by advocating for language rights. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for all of the great information that has already been shared. I'll just give Tracy a second to get us back. So I'm going to talk specifically about some of the barriers, services, and advocacy during COVID-19. So I know that we're running a little behind, so I'll try to go quickly. Next slide. This is no surprise to anybody, but the tech access has been one of the largest barriers. Many of our communities have unstable or no internet connections, limits on phone data. They may not have computers or printers at home. Unfamiliarity with using email and text as a form of applying for and receiving benefits has been a big issue. And as was discussed before, there's an increased risk in cases of domestic violence and getting information out to those individuals who need help. The access to the information has also been a big barrier. There's a huge lack of in-language, plain language, accurate and updated materials from government agencies, courts, schools, media, and especially true, as was said, for languages other than Spanish. So this includes print materials, websites, signage, videos, postings on buildings. All of these things are necessary to do in multiple languages. And as was just discussed, the inappropriate use of Google Translate. I think that's been used widely by many agencies on websites and even on flyers. And I think that's done a huge disservice and has been discriminatory and offensive to our very diverse communities. The next slide, just a couple other things that I've sort of already covered, but the access to benefits and services. In addition to the barriers, there's also fear in many communities because they're uninsured or because of their immigration status that has had to be addressed, especially if they're not eligible for some of the relief that's available. And then access to trained qualified professional interpreters in all of the languages and variants needed by all of our communities. And this has been true for nonprofits and government agencies, hospitals, clinics, schools, across the board. It's been very challenging. So we can go to some approaches to address barriers. I think a lot of individuals thought that we were closed, that many of us were closed, that everything was closed. And so for those who are still operating even remotely, it's been important to use proactive outreach to non-dominant language users through quality written translations, trained bilingual staff, and obviously interpreting services, building in extra time to explain how to navigate various programs, downloading apps, creating email addresses. That's been really critical. Obviously the translation of documents, fact sheets, websites, all of those things have been critical. and collaboration. Some of us in Los Angeles came together around some of the eviction protections, and we created a sample letter that individuals could write to their landlords, and we translated that between several organizations. We were able to translate it into many languages and share those materials with each other. So that's been really important. The next slide, I just want to share quickly some postcards that we made. We have it in a couple of other languages as well, but we distributed these at various locations, markets, places that we thought people would go. So that's just one little example. If you go to the next slide, other approaches, we've already talked about working with remote interpreters. I think the next point has been really critical in terms of providing equipment, Wi-Fi access, training and technical assistance, not only to our client communities, but also to our own staff at our organizations as we shift the way that we normally provide services. I think it's been really difficult because many of our client communities prefer in-person, face-to-face contact. And so it's been really hard to reach out and continue the communication. Obviously, we've had to invest a lot of time and resources into that. Obviously, interpreters also have had to make that shift too. Many of them who have been used to in-person interpreting have also had to learn how to work remotely and think about things like privacy concerns and what other types of equipment they may need and protocols. And then I think the courts have been a big area. I know a lot of questions came in about the courts, but I think it's especially critical to consider what safeguards are needed in the technology used by courts, as well as whether they have the bandwidth, whether they're positioned properly to ensure that all parties can participate. The idea of video remote interpreting has been piloted and used in some courthouses, and obviously it was not favored as the primary means of interpreting in the past, but now we have to think about it more as many courts are putting their proceedings remote and distributing information around how parties can participate, how interpreters can participate. So all of those things, there has to be clear instructions to all individuals involved on how they can meaningfully access the courts. The next slide is just a quick example of the next thing that I was going to talk about is the huge heavy lift that community organizations have taken because government agencies have not provided the information in appropriate languages, appropriately in different languages. And so this is just one example. This organization, they go online almost every day, giving step-by-step instructions on different updates, how to apply for unemployment benefits, Q&As. Literally, sometimes they're reading off the websites of our state labor agency because it's not available in different languages. So this has been a huge resource. You'll see some of these have, over 15,000 views. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that's one of the approaches that some community-based organizations have taken. YouTube, Facebook, they've all been platforms for this on various topics. Obviously, telling our clients to advocate for their own language rights has been important. Also, government entities working with local stakeholders. Some of the agencies have been giving us information, but then expecting us to disseminate it in different languages, which it should not be our burden. We should not be the main vehicle for doing that. And so we've suggested that some of these government agencies should pay or contract with community organizations to help them, to partner with them, because they're already trusted organizations within the community. And then finally, it's advocacy. It's our advocacy within legal aid groups and other organizations to push these government-funded entities for sign and spoken language interpreting and translated materials and other meaningful access to all of their services. So I'll just quickly go to the next couple slides. We developed some very basic templates around advocacy letters that you could use to reach out to your local courts, health departments, schools, housing departments, unemployment agencies, other places. They provide a background on legal mandates. They provide a way to demonstrate the need and the data in your local areas. And then they have some sample demands. You know, this is what we want. We want qualified professional interpreting in real time. We want quality professional translations, no family friend and friends used. We don't want Google Translate used. We want staff to be trained on how to get interpreters on the line if needed. We want multilingual information. And so there's just some sample language there that you can use. And if you go to the next page, there are some links to those on Google that you can download. They're in view only mode, and then you can download them and adapt them. So the next few slides are just some examples. Elena already mentioned the Washington State example. They have a language access plan that requires vital information to be translated into the top 37 languages. There's also other things in there about utilizing telephonic interpreting. And the next slide is an example of a disaster relief program that we had in California for individuals who are not eligible for regular unemployment and pandemic unemployment, mostly because of their immigration status. It wasn't perfect, but this agency, government agency, contracted with 12 nonprofit organizations to administer the program, and before the rollout, they had FAQs available in 17 languages. So that's, you know, an example of an effort made to provide some language access. And then I also wanted to highlight on the next page, Hawaii has their resources available in a number of languages. And so there are some government agencies taking steps to do it. Obviously, it's not perfect. It's not language justice yet, but I just wanted to show a few examples of that. And then the next several pages here are helpful resources, and hopefully you can utilize those. You know, depending, some of them are sector specific, some of them are specifically on language access and language justice, and others are more focused on certain areas like housing or health, legal, things like that. So with that, I'll pass it back to Casey to do maybe have us answer a few questions and wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Joann. We're now going to transition into the question and answer portion of the program. I will be pulling from the questions that were submitted during registration, as well as hopefully a couple questions that were submitted live during this program. I know that we're close to the top of the hour, but we did receive several questions on the ethical do's and don'ts for lawyers who speak or attempt to speak other languages. So I'd like to toss that question to Jeannie to talk about what the ethical do's and don'ts are for lawyers who speak or maybe think they speak other languages. Jeannie? Sure,
thanks, Casey. And it's great to see all the comments in the chat box. So it's great to see everyone, everyone's contributions. So, I would look to answer the question. I would look at your jurisdiction's ethical opinions on this, if this is something that they have covered, because some of them have. But I think that the best practice in even considering ethical duties is still to work with a qualified interpreter. I think we can talk about the competence and communication rules of professional conduct, right, and what is necessary to provide competent representation. Also, and interpreters have their own rules and ethical rules, and they go through that special training needed to fulfill an interpretation effectively, something that sometimes or maybe bilingual lawyers may not have been exposed to. You know, bilingual attorneys doing both the role of the attorney and an interpreter may impact that representation if there are conflicts within those roles, in terms of watching out for the interest of providing an effective interpretation and also watching out for the interest of a competent representation.
Thanks, Jeannie. So our next question is going to go to Elena. Elena, Great. Elena, this question is, how do we go about encouraging our firms, funders, and organizers to see how important language justice is?
That's a great question. And I can tell you that in the last 10 years, I and my collaborators have tried a lot of different things. And what has been most effective in my experience is providing opportunities for funders, colleagues, community partners to have hands-on experience of what it's like to be in an environment that uses language justice best practices, because so many people have never experienced best practices before. Their only experience with cross-language communication may have been terrible or just very limited. And so just an example of that was something that was very effective is in the last organization I worked for, Just Communities. We offered community interpreter trainings, and then after the trainings we would do a reception with the graduates of the trainings, our funders, community partners, and guests that were invited by the trainees. And the training graduates would give presentations about what the training, the impact it had on them, what they learned, what they need from others who were there to promote language justice. And we would use best practices during the event, including bidirectional simultaneous interpreting. In our case, it was usually between Mixteco, Spanish, and English, multilingual materials. And for many of our funders there, that was the first time that they were ever able to have a direct dialogue and conversation with Mixteco speakers, for example. And that experience of cross-language connection can be really transformative. And we saw our funders after those events not only continue to support our work, which is great, but actually go back and be self-reflective and change, do things like create opportunities for people who use non-English languages to submit applications for funding in their own language, or things like that. So they went back and improved their own practices. And I really saw the crucial change coming after funders, as individuals, as people, having a powerful experience, being able to connect with people who use different languages in their own community who maybe they had never talked to before.
Thank you. And our next question is going to go to Joann. This question comes from someone who works in the field of sexual and family violence, and they're interested in your perspective on language justice for victims.
Sure, I know that this has been a big issue because there's been an increased risk for those who are facing domestic violence during this time. And it's been a challenge to ensure that those individuals know that they can still reach out for help. You know, our courts were closed for a period of time, and they let us know that individuals who need protection should seek emergency protective orders through the police, which is a different way of seeking a very short amount of time to be protected while you can then go to court to get a restraining order. And it was hard to get that word out. People did not know that was a way that they could get protection. That's been really important to work with different shelters to know like what level of service that they're providing so that individuals can meaningfully access law enforcement, legal services, you know, and eventually the courts when they reopened. I think healthcare has also been an issue. Where can they go to get COVID testing, not only COVID testing, but also treatment for any injuries, care without interference from their abusers, and even undergoing sexual assault examinations as necessary. And then also economic assistance that allow survivors to escape. Some of our shelters were not accepting new residents, but they were offering hotel vouchers. So just, you know, keeping our lines open and collaborating with other organizations to make sure that those who are seeking assistance were able to get those updates in real time. And obviously that was a big challenge because many of these government agencies were not providing the information in language. So we had to not only provide the information, but make sure we were providing it with the appropriate language services or through our bilingual staff. And I think now that courts are going towards more remote hearings, groups here in Los Angeles are considering possible collaborations with, various places that are now open, like libraries or other organizations, to create studios or places that people can come to participate in those remote hearings if they don't have the technology at home. So with appropriate social distancing guidelines for them to come in and they can use and access our technology to participate in those hearings. And so I think being creative and trying to figure out ways that we could collaborate and get the word out. We had another campaign where we were passing around information at grocery stores and markets, places we thought victims and survivors would be able to access. So it's been a big challenge. And hopefully we can coordinate and work together to ensure that we provide services to that very important community.
Thank you. And we're going to try to just do one more question. I know it's past the top of the hour. This question's for Elena. Elena, sometimes lawyers ask the interpreter to explain a question to their client. Can you tell us how interpreters handle or should handle this request? Clearly, we have lawyers and non-lawyers on the call today, and I think this is to kind of clear up a misunderstanding, I think.
Thank you, Casey. I see there's such an interesting conversation happening in the chat that relates to the roles of interpreters and translators, which is really relevant to this question. And I hope we have the opportunity to provide more dialogue and information about best practices for working with interpreters. But this one is really key. And it comes back to remembering the role of an interpreter, which is to transmit a message from one language into another language using spoken or sign language without adding, changing, or deleting anything. So the interpreter's role isn't to be there to educate about legal concepts or to participate in the conversation or provide legal advice. It's to be a conduit so that the attorney and the client, if we're talking about legal services, can communicate directly and ideally can build trust and build a relationship because of the professional communication work that interpreter is doing. So people ask all the time, but legal terms are really hard to everyone in any language. Shouldn't the interpreter break down the term and explain what it means to the client? And ideally, the best person to break down that legal term and make it understandable in plain language is the attorney. And then the interpreter's role is to interpret, to convey that simplified or plain language definition into the other language. And one of the reasons that's appropriate is just based on our training. As an interpreter, as much as I love hanging out with attorneys, I'm not one. I haven't been to law school. I don't have the kind of nuanced understanding of the law that you all have as attorneys. And I want a client to be getting an explanation of legal concepts from the person there with the expertise to do that. And then the interpreter's role is to convey that meaning, convey those concepts into the other language. So if the interpreter is asked to explain a term, the best thing that they can do is politely ask the attorney to please explain the term or the concept, and they would be happy to interpret the attorney's hopefully plain language, very simple and understandable definition into the other language. And then ideally there's time. One of the things that I always encourage the attorneys I work with to do when they're working with an interpreter is make sure they're allowing for a lot of back and forth and checking in for understanding, so that there's a chance to hear from clients if they understand or not, or if they need something to be described in a different way so that they can fully understand it. And just a quick add-on, interpreters are trained. We're trained about how to politely and concisely intervene if we have a concern that a client is totally not understanding something that's happening or there's some other kind of major miscommunication. But our role is to highlight the problem and then allow the parties to work it out, and we'll support the communication so that they can do that.
All right, well, thank you so much. This is the end of our program. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists. I want to thank Tracy and the wonderful staff at the ABA. This has been a wonderful discussion today between attorneys and interpreters, especially in our chat box. And I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.